You can buy nut trees from the nursery. The better and cheaper way is to plant the nuts directly where you're going to have them grow. That way the taproot is never damaged, because almost all nut trees are taprooted. And they will be less liable to winter kill that first winter, because it's the tricky winters is the first couple of years on a nut tree. So you're going to have, it's going to be hardier, it's going to be, and I learned this from Leah from Mishrin in Russia, who's a famous plant breeder. He was the equivalent of like our Luther Burbank. And he stated in one of his books that when he planted peach pits or apricots, whatever he was breeding, if he planted it in a place and grew it there without ever having transplanted it, it was more likely to throw a superior fruit. In other words, just the act of transplant, because you plant a seed and that's going to produce something a little different than the parent. And in his breeding work, he found that if he never disturbed the plant, it was more likely to throw a superior fruit. In other words, you gain not only hardiness, you also gain a little bit of advantage in terms of the quality of what you're going to get. And of course, that's not every time, but that was a really significant finding. And when you plant what's sometimes they use the word in situ instead of in situ planting, or direct seeding is another word for it, direct seeding. And so I remember a guy in Quebec wrote me, and he said, I have a special trick for how to grow my walnuts. And from direct seeding, he says, the squirrels want to dig them up. They can smell them. I have a bucket of really wet cow poop with me, and I plant the walnut, and then I take a big scoop of the poop and put it over it. It mulches it, it fertilizes it, and it protects it. Here's another trick. When you plant that walnut in the ground, take a handful of peat moss and put some peat moss over the nut. The nut is used to being on a forest floor with acid leaf mold around it, so having, I guess, even leaf mold compost would even be better, but peat moss will suffice. Because I used to work in a nursery, and when we seeded out rows and rows and rows of nuts, we had to go and sprinkle peat moss all along the row before we covered it up with the dirt. So we could do a lot more direct seeding, and it's a heck of a lot cheaper than buying all those. You buy a pound of walnuts or collect them yourself and then seed them out there. You're not having to spend that $1.50 to $2.50 for a seedling tree.
Is there any alternative you can recommend to peat moss, seeing as most peat moss is essentially strip mined from the environment? It's actually really
make your own leaf mold compost. So, and leaf mold compost is great stuff, and people are trying to get rid of it all the time.
So when you plant these nuts, do you go deep with them, like 2-3 inches, or you just let
Well, the rule of thumb is twice the diameter of the seed. So you got a walnut that big, you want it probably down like that. So you want it, it has to be in there a little ways. Big nuts, you want it deeper. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about filberts. Filberts and hazelnuts, they want to be a multi-stem shrub. You buy one, you plant it, and then other shoots start coming up. And so you end up with this multi-stem shrub. And if you, there's a number of things, and they're very flexible. The Latin on it is corylus. Filberts are very flexible, and they are used to make hurdles. You know what a hurdle is? You're going to jump over the hurdle. It's a woven fence, woven of mainly filbert withes. A withe is that you cut off this long shoot, and I can take a long shoot of it and I can tie it in a knot. without it breaking. It's a very flexible wood. So they used it in Europe big time. It was a major thing for making baskets, fences, trellises, wattle and daub houses. You know what those are? You know, a wattle and daub is where you basically weave a basket for a wall and then you pack in mud around in there and it dries and you have a wall. So wattle and daub.
So can you do that when they're alive, or do you have to cut them off? I mean,
Well,
can you make a living fence is what I'm saying.
Well, you could, if you planted them in a row, you could weave them together and they would grow alive. Yes, that would be biological architecture, biotecture, living fences. Yeah, so you could do that. In fact, I'll explain another term in a minute here. Let's put it up here so I don't forget. Flashing. Okay. So, at any rate, one of the things I want to point out is that I've seen this happen in the wild where one of these, a branch or something fell on it and all of a sudden it's laying down pretty horizontal here. And it will send up a huge amount of horizontal or vertical shoots from the horizontal stem. And you got a whole forest of these to work with. If you can also, down here, you know, where it's out here, you can peg that down and throw a mound of soil over it and it will root here and that will become a new mother plant out here. So if I did that out here and another one out here, I could start with one plant and then after a number of years I could have all these and then of course I could stake those out and I could work my way across the landscape by pegging down and rooting. That is called layering when you do that type of propagation. You are doing layering. And this is a lot of vines, that's how they propagate, and this is how they actually propagate it. When you buy filberts in a nursery, from a nursery, a named variety like Ennis or Butler, you're going to get something that looks like that with just a few little roots here, and here's your main stalk, and it's like hardly any roots. It's just like, it's a jade plant. That's because they had, you know, bent something over and rooted it here, and then they cut it off here, and that's what you buy, is that rooted cutting. So that's how they propagate filberts, because filbert nuts, growing from nuts itself, you don't get anything like the parent. It's kind of like apples. They don't come true to seed very well. So all the named varieties, and they don't grow from cuttings, so you have to do this layering. So it's another way that you can do this, though, Todd, sometimes if you take off, and they do this with apples, and I imagine you could do it with filberts, you cut all these off and make a big mound of soil here, and then everywhere it was cut off, they all send up new shoots, and because the old ground level's here, they root into the mound, and then you dig it up next year and cut everything off here, you still got all the roots down here, and do it all over again, mound it up, and they shoot up, and so that is called a stool bed when you do that kind of propagation. So filbert is a very high value crop. Even if you don't get the nuts, it's really high value just for the wood, just for that weaving stuff. So I think at some point somebody will establish a filbert hazelnut planting here in Montana, with the primary thing being getting the fiber. Again, it's a wood weaving plant. Maybe you got 10 filberts or 20, they do this with apple root stock and things too. It's like that's propagation stock. Every one of those you can sell to somebody for $3. So I'm like, I got $30 from that stool bed this year. I'll get $30 again next year. It's a way of making money and getting new plants.
So you mean to cut and then root what you cut off?
Because you cut it off down here and it's rooted into the mound, so it's gonna look when you cut it, it's gonna look like this. That's what you sell. You've got a top and you've got a rooted bottom, and then it's gonna regrow. The root is gonna do that every year in and year. It just keeps going. There's a limit to how long you can do it, but you can get a stool bed to go for quite many years, depending on what you're doing. So it's a form of propagation.
What's the native environment like where filberts grow naturally?
It's an understory tree in a forest. So in Europe, in England particularly, they have big plots of forest with widely spaced oak trees in the system, and in between it, there would be lots of filberts, sometimes alders, which is nitrogen fixing. They would have an understory species of shrub in there that they coppiced. Coppice, we haven't really covered yet, but maybe you know that. But coppice is when, basically it's similar to this. I've got a tree and it's growing vigorously, and I will cut it off to a stump, usually, a foot above ground, and you always make a sloping cut here so water runs off. If it's flat, it wants to rot out in the middle. And then that will resprout, oftentimes multiple times, so you may end up just selecting to one sprout, or you may leave several, or you may leave them all, and it resprouts, and then after a number of years, they get bigger and bigger diameter. At some point, you go and coppice it again, and then they all resprout. So it's a way of you keep getting wood year after year. But some things you coppice really quickly, like willow plantations for basketry willows, you coppice it every year. They grow up, you cut it off. They grow up, you cut it off, and you do that year after year. But if you let it grow for 2 or 3 years, then you just get a bigger diameter, and then you cut it off. So it depends on what diameter you're going after. Beech trees they do that with beech trees. You can do it with oak trees. You can do it with chestnut trees. Many hardwood trees coppice. In fact, we might even say most of them do, but not all of them.
So
But
what is that, how does that affect the root? When I know you kind of
well,
said that
generally,
there, but.
we generally say in Plant Kingdom is that when you cut the tops of something off, there's a certain amount of root dieback. Remember, I thought that was interesting that Martin Crawford referred to the winter dieback of those surface roots I described earlier in the course, that there's a surface roots that are really close to the surface that they die back in the winter and then regrow. He pointed that out again. But when you coppice anything or cut grass off, some of that root matter out here, some of it dies back, sort of like, oh, some of the top's gone, we'll slough some of the roots off, but then it regrows. So
it doesn't really shorten the life or starve the
oh,
plant
it
over
might
time.
shorten the life, but some of these coppices in Europe run for hundreds of years. So and sometimes they only coppiced it once every 15 years on a 15-year rotation. So they're going for big diameter stuff, and they use it for charcoal and for firewood and for other types of uses. So they're not after the flexible things, they're after wood. And so the oak trees eventually would get really big and make really high quality timber, but in the meantime, they had all this hazelnut coppice or alder coppice. Those are probably the most commonly used coppice with it. You can do, coppice is something they use. They do this a lot in the third world. We don't do it much here because we have big trees in Montana with sawmills, and who needs to coppice? Get wood that way. Let's look at flashing and pleaching now that we got coppicing down. Actually, let's do pleaching. If you cut, so this is a coppice at a stump. If you have a tree that you grow up and it gets nice and big tree, and it's got these big branches that go out, big branches. If you come up here and cut off all these major branches here, then they'll resprout, and there'll be a ton of shoots there. And so it's, in a sense, it's coppicing higher up in the tree, and that is called pollarding. So if you pollard a tree, and you'll see that all over the cities. Like they said, oh, that tree's too close to the power lines. We'll just saw off a bunch of the branches and it'll just shoot up. That's pollarding. They did this a lot in Europe to feed livestock. In fact, in Netherlands, this was a traditional form of management of the trees there, but they didn't really need to do it because they could bring in hay from Hungary or whatever else. So they stopped doing it, and the Dutch people started getting nostalgic. Remember all those trees? They were all looked at a certain pollarded way. We miss it. So now they pay people to go and pollard the trees just so it looks nice. But this is a way of getting food for your livestock. This is very common in Nepal. In Nepal and India, women climb up into the trees, it's the woman's job, and they go out here on the limbs, and they knock off the branches, and they fall to the ground, and they gather them up, and they take them home to their stall-fed livestock. What's the biggest cause of death of women in Nepal?
Falling out of trees.
Falling out of trees. Because I've got some pictures of these women out there on the ends of these limbs. They're like, oh, I'm trying to get that stuff out there. They're over a rocky precipice. You know, so it's...
It's the
So-
biggest cause of death, really.
Huh?
Is it really the biggest cause of death?
Yeah, I heard that. I mean, I read it or saw that. I mean, it's probably not, it may not be true, but it's a lot of women fall out of trees and die or get injured. I don't know if it's, you know, who knows? The people that are doing statistical analysis in Nepal really are guessing on a lot of things. They don't have a whole lot of government officials marching around counting things there in Nepal as they do here. Much more free country. Okay, so we're talking about pollarding. And the reason they did this, if they composted it close to the ground, the livestock would come along and eat all the new shoots. So they didn't want to compost until it was out of the reach of the livestock. That's why they were doing that particular pollarding to get the animal food. Because a lot of trees are really great animal food. Poplars and willows, cottonwoods, great food for livestock. So you can grow it, cut it down, feed it to the livestock, and it's one of the livestock feeds. So feeding livestock trees is something we don't think of in this country, but it's big in some parts of the world. So I'm going to talk about live fences for a minute here. So I've got an area I want to fence off from deer, and I'm going to plant trees and shrubs. Well, let's say I don't want to get too tall, so I'm going to just plant a whole bunch of shrubs, and I'm going to plant them kind of close. Let's say I'm going to plant them 3 feet apart. So here's my shrubs, and they get growing, and they grow taller, and they start branching out. And I want to plant a fair amount of thorny things in there. So things like the sea buckthorn, hawthorn is like the preeminent hedgerow, thorny hedgerow tree. Think any other?
Raspberry.
You could, well, raspberries, this is going to be tight and dark, but it's a good place to put running raspberries in. So blackberries, if you are dry enough to, but what's the thing here I'll point out in just a second. But one that works really good here is the black-capped raspberry. When we got into berries last night, we neglected. The black-capped raspberry is native here and has long runners, and then it hits the ground, digs in, roots, and then tip layers. That's called tip layering. It's kind of, it tip layers, and then that then arches out, hits the ground, tip layers. So it basically leapfrogs around the landscape. If you plant some of those in there, they're going to be running around there. And black-cap raspberries are gnarly, big stems, and that adds a horizontal arrangement. But what you do after a while, after this gets started, is you coppice every other one, or some of them, and then they're going to spring up and with a much more wild, really make it more dense.
What height
So-
are you doing that at?
I'm going to be doing it about 6 inches or a foot off the ground, coppice. Another thing I can do is what's called flashing. And this is done in Europe big time on their hedgerows. So imagine this, I've got a hawthorn up here, and it's maybe 10 feet tall, and it's got some branches maybe that big around. And I grab, with my heavy leather gloves, I grab that and I start bending, and it's pretty rigid stuff. It ain't going to bend very easily, but it's bending somewhat. And I have a little saw in this hand, and I saw a little bit on the top, right here maybe, or maybe right here. And I saw some, and at one point I go crack, and lays flat, horizontal. But it's still connected by a strip of bark on the bottom. I've cut through most of the wood, but there's a little bit of wood left, and there's still that bark. It doesn't die because I haven't cut it totally off, but now it's limp. And so when I have those branches that I've plashed or laid down, it's going to spring up, you know, so if I flash a whole bunch here, it springs up with a whole bunch of horizontal growth, and now I've got good coverage on from the bottom from the coppicing, and because of the flashing, I get a lot of, besides vertical, I get a lot of horizontal coverage. Nothing can get through it. Rabbits can get through it. In England and Europe, they made these things so tight that it could keep, you know, I hesitate to say hogs, but they used it for cattle, sheep, horses, you know, pretty much all livestock can be confined in a plashed, you know, that's called plashing, a plashed hedge. And it's also called laying the hedge. So they had people that was their job. They had big leather gloves, gauntlets, leather gauntlets, and they went out and laid the hedge every certain number of years. And when they laid the hedge, I mean, they laid everything at an angle like that. The whole hedge was laid over at an angle, and then the whole thing sprung up. And these things were incredibly tight. So laying the hedge plastic, we don't have to go to that extreme, but we can grow our own live fences that are good for livestock and will keep out deer, and will have multiple purposes, because I'm harvesting the hawthorn berries, the hawthorn flowers. I can have seed buckthorn in there. I can have some filberts in there. So vines are good too, if you can have vines that run around in there. Vining roses, again, that's another element.
So what,
Strength.
it's like hawthorns and stuff you're doing this too? What
Yeah.
kind of plant?
Hawthorns are typical in Europe, but slow plums was another one they used, which is a thorny type of plum. And as Martin Crawford pointed out in his thing, you can take those slow plums and graft another type of plum onto it. But anyway, there are many species we can use. In fact, it'd be neat for someone to take their species index. Assignment is, what are the hedgerow species for live fences here in Montana? That would be a good assignment.
I wanted to point out, if you're using raspberries or blackberries to do this, and you want to hold in cattle, they'll eat it.
Oh yeah, they
I
will.
don't know about hawthorn or seaberry, but blackberries and raspberries, they will.
Oh yeah, and deer love to eat them too. So sometimes to establish these things in the face of heavy grazing pressure, you have to actually build a fence, grow what you want on the other side of the fence, and then after a certain period of time, when that's really up and going, you can take the fence down and move it somewhere else to get another part going. So it's just so sometimes that's true, if you have heavy grazing pressure. But the hawthorns, they have they're really thorny, so
Yeah.
a cow probably doesn't want to really, they will nibble the edges, but they won't try to like get in there. But raspberries, they particularly will, so that's a good point. When we planted our deer fence at our place in Chelan, I wasn't there actually, Muriel did all this. I try to take some credit. But they put up a deer fence with posts in the ground, and then she planted all along it black locust and Russian olive and elderberries and oaks and chestnuts and all kinds of trees right along the fence line. And as they grew up, they would shove branches, their little branches through the fence, and then all the posts have rotted out over the years on the whole deer fence, and sections of the deer fence fall down and have to be replaced, but not this section, because the fence posts are long gone, but the trees, branches through that are holding up there. That fence ain't going nowhere. That fence is there. There's never going to be any fence posts to rot out. So if you do plan on having a deer fence, plant your replacement posts. When you build the fence, you'll never have to replace your posts again. So that's a nice tip.
So around Toowoomba, there's a Caragana hedge around portions of it, but there's spaces in between the main plant stems. What could you interplant?
Well, they're so well established, I don't think you can get anything in there now. But you could do some layering over of the branches and stuff and get more horizontal coverage. But I always put pea shrubs. Huh?
Can you flash those?
Oh yeah, definitely, and coppice them. So I'm a big fan of Caragana or Siberian pea shrub in hedgerows. It's nitrogen fixing, slightly spiny. It's not thorny, slightly spiny, but it would be a really good addition to one of these. if you wanted to just use one species, I would use hawthorn. But in permaculture, we want diversity. I usually will plant a section of hawthorn, then a section of carragana, then a section of chokecherry, but I could also intersperse them. In fact, I've done that quite a bit. It's amazing to me, it's interesting because Martin Crawford in his talk, in his video, he said, each tree needs a lot of space. You don't want to have them too close so you can get good production. And I said, well, you know, that's true for a lot of things, but in my hedgerows, I plant things at 3-foot spacing, and I have juniper and red osier dogwood and carragana and all kinds of trees and shrubs in there, and it's amazing that 15 years later now, that hedgerow is dense. It is like, you know, it's definitely a deer-proof hedge. And all those things, you'll see, this is sticking out and that's, and they're all doing well. I mean, I was like, some of these are going to be out-competed and they're going to die. That's what I figured. It's like the weakest ones will die out of the system. But so far, at 15 years of age, they're all doing well. They've all figured out how to work together. They all are getting some sunlight. They're all growing up. And I'm very impressed with it.
Thinking about doing some sort of, deer exclusion hedge in a more urban setting, how much width would you anticipate that they would?
Well, you have to choose your species to be fastigiate, and you'll be trimming and pruning it. You might prune things that get too wild. Carragana are pretty relatively straight up. Again, so you have to pick your species more carefully. Look for those fastigiate things. Carragana is the most widely used hedgerow species in the Columbia Basin, and I don't know, and I'm sure that it's used a whole lot in Montana. I have never in my life seen a wild carragana just like, oh look, right? I've only seen them where they were planted. I've seen patches expand, but I've never ever seen in my life a carragana that was growing out. So the idea that it's really invasive, I'm actually doubtful of that. Oh yeah, people live along the river and plant things in Old Homestead. So, like I say, I've never ever seen it, and I am an acute observer and know that plant and love it. So I'm a little offended by the idea that it would be dangerous, but it might be true, but worth checking out.
How does carragana reproduce?
From seed.
So it's not sending seeds out from?
Well, it must.
So
But like I said, I've never seen it appear over there because I planted it here.
Oh, it's sucker?
It suckers, but not wildly. It suckers just around its base. It doesn't like, oh my God, look at the sucker over there. Bamboo really suckers. Sea buckthorn will really sucker. It's like, oh my God, I got sea buckthorn spreading. So suckering, thicket forming, you really want to know, there's a species index. What woody plants in Montana sucker? And cottonwood sucker. Black locust sucker. So some things sucker out, and that can be problems where you don't want it to sucker.
Now it might seem obvious, but I mean, in terms of trying to establish a hedgerow, you probably would want to do all of your coppicing well before you ever started thinking about doing splashing. Splashing, you're basically sealing up the fence, and after that, you don't want to come through and coppice your hedgerow and cut down all of your flash branches that you put to create the beam. So you'd want to, like, your first couple of seasons before you start, closing it up, do all of your coppicing, you get those extra sheets, and you don't want to go back to that and then coppice it after you've established it.
Well, generally speaking, I would agree with that. Generally, I would coppice before flashing, but it's probably more complicated than a simple formula like that.